Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, everyone. It's good to be here. Thanks for inviting me, introducing me. I don't have a presentation slides. Things are very busy right now, and I haven't had a chance. This is something that I published in 2017. So the research was probably more than 7 or 8 years ago. And I don't think I ever fully presented. I think I presented a version at a conference at one point, but I've never really presented this, so it's good to do so.
We're honored.
And I think it's been cited. People have paid attention. I think I've been refuted, apparently. I wasn't that enamored by the refutation. But I will present what I understand is going on, what I think the material is telling us, and hopefully it's useful, and hopefully people can ask some questions as well. So I want to sort of I'm not going to try to fully go through the paper. It's 30 pages, and there's no way I can do that in 25 minutes accurately and deal with everything. So rather than that, I want to talk about the paper with the hope, or the article, with the hope that people will be interested to read themselves if they haven't already, or they can, if they already know about it, there's a recap and they can ask questions. So what this article is about is a few things. It's about the readings of the companion Ibn Masʿūd, the distinctive harf of Ibn Masūd. Earlier versions were talking about like the legacy of the harf or something like that. I had some idea about that. I also had at one point this idea. It was once going to be focused on Ibrahim al-Nakha'i, because it's also about Ibrahim al-Nakha'i, this early Kufan jurist and scholar in many respects, and who was a transmitter of this recitation of the Quran. And at one point it was going to be in 2 parts. So what I'm saying is there's been various iterations, and finally it ended up at this idea of the legal epistemology of Quranic variants. Well, why? Because although I'm going to talk about the harf of Ibn Masūd, and that's important context in order to be able to say what I want to say, what the article actually does is talk about how it was received in the Hanafi school. And this is, I think, what's of interest to to the particular event right here, this connection with Hanafism. And what I want to show is some of the ways that the Hanafi scholars were able to frame the idea of these variants and deal with the variants of Ibn Masūd. Because as a non-canonical reading, the Ibn Masūd variants present a sort of challenge. And there's different strategies to deal with that challenge. And I want to sort of explain, using the article, some of the strategies that were taken, and how there's a kind of development through the early period of the school, these early jurists in the Hanafi school, and how they are kind of, in a way, constructing the framework to understand these variants, along with the development of ideas in usul fiqh as well. So there's a discussion of a kind of usuli discussion that's important. So hopefully this will come together and be coherent. So I want to sort of tell this story, and what the story will be. Just to, we like to give away the end at the beginning when we do academic work, and I tell this to my students. The story is, how can we take Ibn Masūd's variants from being potentially an alternative canon or alternative version reading of the Quran that could be challenging to orthodoxy, and how can we deal with the fact that some of the Hanafi positions rely on these variants as evidence, and then how can we then make sure they're not a challenge? And that's what the school dealt with, and they end up being a kind of sort of tafsir that is used to elaborate the law, but not kind of challenge in any way the canon of the Quran. So let's get into it. So obviously I can't defend everything I'm going to say in detail here, and other people have different views anyway, but I will give you my take and the evidence as it is in the paper, and you can look for yourself and join in the refutations if you like, or think maybe I've got a good point. So what's happening here, as is well known, we have in the early period, and I don't intend to go too deep on the sort of Sahaba radiallahu anhum readings, but we have various companions reading the Quran in different ways. This is indisputable. Everyone knows this. They read in different ways, and some of these ways are at variance with what is to become the Ottomanic Codex. And the most prominent of these companions is, of course, Ibn Masūd. And Ibn Masūd claims a great legacy as an early companion of the Prophet ﷺ, and someone with great authority and knowledge of the Quran. You know, and he's very prominent also in tafsir and in hadith and in fiqh and all these kind of early genres before we even had these distinct sort of disciplines in the very early period of Islam. And one of the things he's doing is he's reading the Quran. And he's saying, this is how, you know, I've read to the Prophet ﷺ, or I've taken it from the Prophet ﷺ, this is the Quran, and he's reading it. And I don't want to go too much into his own reading and, you know, trying to pin it down, which is not the main purpose of my article. But my understanding is, at the very least, we can say that he fully believed and held that his reading was correct and was correct as a reading of the Quran, and yet it doesn't in every place agree with what is found within the canonical Mus'haf. And it's very, you know, this goes into the area of the Sabbath Afro and all these things, but I don't want to go too much into those areas today. But he's reading in this way. And in fact, when Umar radiallahu anh sends him to Kufa, he is reading in Kufa according to his understanding, and he's writing Masahif, and a tradition of scholarship is coming around him, his major students, Alqama and Aswad and so on, and Ibrahim al-Nakhai is a kind of next generation student, or student of his students, really. What's happening here is they are transmitting his reading. And, you know, there's various disputed reports of what happened in terms of when the canonical version was brought, and his opposition is recorded, and there's discussion on exactly what was meant and whether he eventually agreed. I don't want to go into that. Personally, I'm not convinced that he agreed to the so-called Harf Zayd, but that's not the issue here, because in any case, it's extremely clear that the people in Kufa continued for about a century or so to recite according to his harf. And this is acknowledged by the Hanafis themselves. And it's acknowledged by figures such as An-Nakhai and those recording from him. And they are saying, this is our recitation. And they are reciting Ibn Mas'ūd's readings. And they are doing it, they are doing this in prayer. And I don't think there's any serious contestation that this happened. Actually, the overall story is an amazing success of the canonization of the Mus'haf. And you can argue this is a very good thing in many ways. And, you know, it's often brought up today in kind of apologia that we have this consistent and coherently transmitted scripture. Alhamdulillah, no problems there. But in terms of what happened in Kufa in the 1st century, it's very clear that they were continuing to read the readings of Ibn Mas'ūd for about a century or so. Read the famous narration coming from Al-A'mash, that when he kind of arrived in Kufa, he wasn't originally from there, people were reading according to and learning according to the harf of Ibn Mas'ūd, and, you know, by the end of his life, it was all the harf of Zayd. So there was this sort of transition in that kind of sort of second half of the 1st century into the 2nd century. Now, and he dies about this at the same time as Abu Hanifa. I think he does in 148 Hijri. So you have this early dominance, and what this means is, for people like An-Nakhai, is he starts to recite and use variants in order to deal with legal issues. So he's using the variants of Ibn Mas'ūd in order to deal with legal issues, and he does two. He uses, I believe, he has 2 variants. Now, what I do in the table on page 76 of the article is I list 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, about 7 different figures, and I classify, as far as I've been able to determine, the variants from Ibn Mas'ūd that they use, or they deal with, or they interpret, and how this relates to fiqh matters. And we have here Nakhai. So I'm not going to go too much into these, but it's worth mentioning a few of them. So you, for example, I'm just going to give you the translation So one of the variants that's the kind of the most famous variant of Ibn Masūd for the legal matters is 589. And this relates to the expiation for breaking an oath. And in translation, God will not take you to account for what is frivolous in your oaths, but he will take you to account for what you swear to in a binding fashion. The expiation for breaking them is the feeding of 10 indigents from the everyday food of your family, or clothing them, or freeing a slave. The one who does not find the means can fast 3 days. فَصِيَامُ ثَلَاثَةِ أَيَّامٍ. Now, in the half of Ibn Masūd, we have فَصِيَامُ ثَلَاثَةِ أَيَّامٍ مُتَتَابِعَةٍ, right? So we have 3 consecutive days. So Ibn Masūd, in his reading, and some will say, okay, this is just a tafsir and he's just adding this in. I think it's very clear that for him, this is the Quran. This is what the Quran, how the Quran is to be read. And I think that's clear from the tradition. I can't prove that today, but it's in the article, the evidence for that. And Nakhai is also reciting in this way. And he refers to this in some narrations as our recitation. And it's clear to me, at least, that this is his recitation and that of the Kufans more generally. And of course, this has an effect on the rule. The fasting has to be consecutive. Again, on 538, so same surah, we have the famous penalty for thievery, and we have cut off the hands of both the male and female thief. And then we have, according to Ibn Masūd and according to also directly from Nakhai in the sources, cut off the right hands of both the male and female thief. And what this basically deals with is whether if someone steals once, then of course it's clear that you cut off their right hand. But what if they steal again? Can they be cut? Is their left hand to be cut off? And so that could be the case, perhaps, according to some jurists. But according to this reading, it's specified it's only the right hand, and therefore that will deal with that issue and close down that possibility. So you have these 2 variants with Nakhai, and this is in the 1st century. And then I go on and I talk about, of course, Muhammad ibn Hassan al-Shaybani, century or so on. And he, again, has these 2, or at least he has one reading. He has the reading of the first one, 589. Now, he doesn't explain, and I don't think I need to introduce who he is, a key figure in the school, in the Hanafi school, and in the consolidation of the written legacy of the school, the main kind of author of the books used by the school, but one of the Sahibain of Abu Hanifa, and kind of a key authority. And he says it has reached us. This is in the reading of Ibn Masūd, and he mentions this reading. So for him, that's enough of an evidence that this is, that this can be used in legal matters. Now, the question that comes for later Hanafis is, okay, this is being used by Imam Muhammad as evidence. How do we deal with this evidence? If it wasn't used by Imam Muhammad, if it just was Nakhai, although Nakhai himself is important for, as a grand teacher of Abu Hanifa anyway, it might be possible to ignore these readings. But because of Shaybani's canonization within the madhab, that this is a source of evidence, later Hanafis are forced to deal with it, I argue. And so what we're going to see is they deal with this in different ways. One of the ways that they argue with it, that they deal with this, well, there's different strategies, and it relates to how do you take such variants? And this is where the legal epistemology comes in. What's the strength of these reports from Ibn Masūd? What authority do they have? And how do we use them in the context of a kind of usuli discussion about sources of law? And so here we have the first figure after this, and I'm just going in this kind of chronological way, which is how the article proceeds. We have al-Māturīdi, someone who I study a lot in terms of his kalām. Here we're thinking about him in terms of a kind of usuli and a commentator on the Quranic verses. And my own journey in scholarship has been kind of increasingly from kind of Quranic studies into kalām and theology as well. So I was already interested in al-Māturīdi in this regard. And so what's fascinating about Imam Māturīdi is a couple of things, I would say. One thing that's understood about his usul, and I'm not a specialist in usul, But one thing is that he is held to have a greater possibility for often for like we could say kind of weaker sources of scripture to be able to modify the Quran. This is what's generally held to hold for his fiqh, compared to what became standard in the Hanafi tradition, which, as everyone is probably reasonably aware, that you need a kind of at least what they call the mashhur level often to kind of modify Quranic statements. So there's quite a strong level of certainty is required to deal with these kind of issues. Now, with these variants, I think he clearly doesn't. So he's not suggesting that the variants are mass transmitted. He says actually, in fact, that at least the readings of Ibn Masūd have the status of the khabar al-ahad, so the unit report, a single narration. And of course, they should be accepted due to his virtues, deep understanding, and long companionship with the Prophet. He basically will say, he brings up, for example, the verse I mentioned about the chopping of the hand, and he says that aydiyahuma, their hands, it has a ambiguity. It's ijmal. It's ambiguous. And what aymanuhuma, what Ibn Masūd's verse can do, is to provide tafsir. It can give this explanative gloss to it. So this is how the way he's taking these verses. And this is his strategy, basically. So for him, what we have with the verses that he wants to deal with is a kind of a lack of full clarity of what their meaning should be, and then the possibility for Ibn Masūd's reading to come along and provide an explanative meaning. So this is a bit like when people say, oh, it's kind of tafsiriyya, it's tafsir-based readings. In function, yes, but he still holds these to be genuinely the reading of the Quran. It seems very, very clear to me from my understanding. He even prioritizes Ibn Masūd over Zayd ibn Thabit in what's known as the Arda Akhira, the final recitation with the Prophet ﷺ in the last year of his life. He actually prioritizes Ibn Masūd's harf in that regard. So he's very clear that this is a genuine transmission. He gives another example of this, which I can mention quickly. So this is 65.6. Basically, it's related to the issues of sakana and nafaqa. House them where you house yourselves according to your means. Askinuhunna min haythu sakantum min wujdikum. And what he basically will say is that the phrase min wujdikum already contains, according to your means, already contains the meaning of provision, of giving provision, and therefore when Ibn Masūd adds an extra part to this verse, he adds wa anfiquhunna, provide for them, i.e. the divorced wives. He will basically he will say, well, actually there's a additional it's not in conflict, there's just an additional explanation going on here. So this is Māturīdi. Now we go on to al-Jassās. I mean, maybe if you just give me a heads up if I'm running out of time. I don't want to go too slow, but I think I'll be on time. So al-Jassās, famous jurist, I recently have written a sort of handbook entry on him actually, but that will come out in due course. But interesting figure in the Hanafi school. He discusses various readings, and he has quite a kind of interesting take on the verses. What I argue in the paper is he has two kind of main approaches. Okay, he has one approach which seems to be maybe an earlier approach, which he takes in Shah Mukhtasar Tahawi, which is a kind of a juristic commentary. And here he's reciting or sort of commenting on these reports of Nakhai taking instruction in the half of Ibn Masūd, Sa'id ibn Jubair alternating between the reading of Zayd and Ibn Masūd in the public prayers, i.e. in Ramadan in the Tarawih. And he quotes this Nakhai. He's the one who quotes fi qira'atina, talking about this being the qira'at of Nakhai. And what he basically says is that the the fact that Ibn Mas'ud's reading was mashhur, famous, mustafid, widespread among the people of Kufa, it makes it permissible to have a addition, a ziyada to the text of the Quran. So he's basically saying, because one thing you need to understand about Jassas is taking a kind of strict view that you cannot add to the Quran unless you have this level that he calls tawatur or istifada, or mashhur, right? And mashhur for him is a stronger mashhur than became dominant in the Hanafi Madhhab. It's a kind of pseudo tawatur, it seems. So he is saying this in his early text, but then in his later texts, which are the Ahkam al-Quran and the Fusul fil Usul, and basically the way this is it's he writes the Fusul and then he writes the Ahkam, and he basically uses the Fusul fil Usul. He uses his Usul Fiqh text to basically provide this kind of usuli take on the whole Quran, which is basically not being surpassed amongst the Hanafis. I mean, in terms of the reception of that text, everyone still goes to Jassas for that particular type of discussion amongst the Hanafis. So what he does in this, and this is also, he starts to think a bit more theoretically. He's not talking so much about, okay, it just was transmitted very strongly in Kufa and therefore it can do this ziyada. He starts to be a bit more theoretical about it. And what he basically starts to talk about is this issue of naskh. And he says that the recitation has to have been abrogated, right? It can't have remained the recitation after the time of the Prophet ﷺ. It has to have been abrogated before then. And what's happened is that the recitation has been abrogated, but the ruling remains. And this is one of the sort of categories that he's using in the Usuli frame. And this is a famous discussion, of course, that you can have these different possibilities, both abrogated, recitation and ruling, just the recitation, but not the ruling, or just the ruling, but not the recitation, which is the one that we sort of, when we look at the verses that we say are mansukh in the Quran, it's because we say just the ruling has been abrogated. By the way, I wrote a separate chapter on the use of naskh theory in Māturīdism works, particularly in the tafsir. So that's a separate thing that can be found again on my website, on my page, and it's quite interesting, but it's not really related to this. So how is this possible, you might ask? Because from historical discussion I've just brought forward, we know that, well, we should know, and even he knows that Nakhai is reciting this. So how is it possible this is happening? Well, I think he gets inconsistent on this point. So what he basically will say is that it's basically to preserve the stability of the Sharia. The abrogation of the rule of the recitation has to happen in the lifetime of the Prophet ﷺ. What does he basically suggests is that he says, like, I'll give you a explanation. I'll quote from my paper. It is necessary that what is in the harf of Abdullah ibn Mas'ud concerning the requirement of consecutive days of fasting for the expiation of an oath was abrogated as recitation during the life of the Prophet, may peace be upon him. This is because people were ordered not to recite it as from the Quran or to write it down. For this reason, the harf was never transmitted to us in the same way that the Quran was. The meaning of their statement that it is in the harf of Abdullah, i.e. Ibn Mas'ud, is that it was part of the Quran in his harf. Then the recitation was abrogated and the ruling remained in effect. If the meaning was that it was established in the harf of Abdullah after the death of the Messenger, peace be upon him, then it would have necessarily been transmitted to us in the same manner as the rest of the Quran, mass transmission, tawatur, and profuse narration, istifada, such that no one doubts it being a part of it. So he's basically completely contradicts, it seems, what he's been narrating on a historical level on this usuli principle. And some people have well, you'll see this view being taken, that it must have been abrogated in the time of the Prophet. That's what happened in the final reading. Or even if maybe Ibn Masūd didn't know it was abrogated, then he was informed of it at the end of his life and he accepted it. So this is one strategy that we've seen, you know, I see it first in Jassas, in order to deal with the variation and control the canon, really. Okay, I want to move on from Jassas now and talk about Al-Quduri. Now, Al-Quduri, slightly later, in the same kind of Iraqi tradition, he's trying to, I think, resolve some of these issues in the or deal with some of the issues raised by Jassas's treatment. You know, he what he basically starts to say is, well, how is it that we seem to have on the one hand these reports about the Quran being recited, these narrations of Ibn Masūd being recited up until the time of Abu Hanifa, and at the same time it seems that they seem to also not have been passed on. Well, it seems to be this abrogation is happening. And what he basically says here in this case is, he says that when the qira'ah, when the harf of Ibn Masūd was passed on in a stronger way, in this kind of mustafid way, which is in the earlier period, then along with that, so when the Quran, you know, harf of Ibn Masūd was being recited in Kufa in a more strong way earlier on, along with that there was also the knowledge of what was abrogated from it. So he's basically reinterpreting these statements that, like, for example, Sa'id ibn Jubair is reciting the harf of Ibn Masūd. In Quduri's take, he's reciting, yes, the reading of Ibn Masūd, that qira'ah, but leaving off anything that was abrogated. So basically it's nothing like the Ibn Masūd harf that we kind of know from these various variants. It's not that. It's just basically maybe the manner of recitation, right? It's not got these kind of variants in the farsh, right? In the actual additions and subtractions and glosses, all these things, and substitutions. So that's what he's saying. So he's kind of trying to, in a way, I mean, you can look at the details in the paper. I want to now turn to Al-Dabusi, another figure. What Al-Dabusi is trying to do, I see, is he's kind of trying to mediate. So just as Quduri was trying to solve some problems in Jassas within the Iraqi tradition, Dabusi is trying to mediate between the Samarkandi tradition of Maturidi and the Iraqi tradition. And what he talks about is he thinks that now the way he does this is he uses a new usuli framework of mutlaq and muqayyad. So what you probably will know from fiqh is that the Hanafis tend to be dubious about if you've got an unrestricted verse of the Quran, an unqualified verse of the Quran, for example, free a slave, tahrir al-raqaba, in one part of the Quran. Hanafis will not want to say that that taqyid is done by another verse that says the raqaba mu'mina, i.e. a believing slave. They won't want to make that taqyid. That's the sort of general usuli position that we're familiar with if we study a bit of Hanafi usul. What Dabusi seems to be saying is that this kind of taqyid is okay, and that actually what Ibn Mas'ud's readings are doing is they are acting as he says, bayan in form but naskh in meaning. So this is what I'm saying, he's mediating between Maturidi and the Iraqis. They're doing a bayan in terms of the form of what they're explaining, which is where he's bringing, I think, in this issue of the taqyid, but it still is a naskh in meaning, i.e. It's still somehow strong enough to deal with the Quran as it is. So he's trying to sort of work between these two traditions. And basically what happens then is the base text of the Quran, the Ottomanic tradition, is kind of considered kind of mutlaq. And then, although the language in those verses is considered mutlaq. And then, so for example, Thalath Ayyam, 3 days. And then the mutatabiyat in the consecutiveness is this taqyid that's being brought from the verse of Ibn Masūd, which allows the ruling to hold. So this is his approach. Again, I don't see this being taken on. And the reason it's not taken on in the later tradition is because, in my view, of as-Sarakhsi. Now, Sarakhsi is this classical, he's about the same time also as Fakhr al-Islam al-Bazdawi. And these are the two figures who really established the usul tradition, the dominant usul tradition for Hanafis. And Sarakhsi has this insight, or this approach, which basically you're going to see a consistency all the way up till the present day as the kind of canonical solution for this issue. And this is the idea that Ibn Masūd's reading is only transmitted as an ahad text, but it reaches mashhur by being narrated, amongst the Kufans and so on. So it reaches kind of mass transmission, like as if it were mutawatir. But then, because it's only ahad originally, you've got this mashhur, and it's like a mashhur hadith. And as something that's like a mashhur hadith, it can provide this kind of ziyada to the Quran. So just like, in the case of the khuffain, wiping on the khuffain, you can have this addition to being able to, or you don't have to wash your feet, you can wipe on the socks because this hadith is mashhur. This same solution, in effect, is given for all of the different readings of Ibn Masūd, and he actually brings forward a number of them, include 538, 233, 589, and and even 65.6. So okay, so he discusses all four. He rejects the variant for 538. So he rejects the amputating the hand variant, because he thinks it would imply that the right leg is to be amputated upon a repeated offense. So he doesn't like that. So that's the views of Sarakhsi. And he, I think, in his time, which is, into the kind of broadly the 5th century or so, he's kind of starting to basically, so he dies at the end of the 5th century. So dies at 483, 1090. And I think here we have a sort of stable approach towards these variants, which is this idea of treating them as mashhur. So just to close, what we have, I think, what I've tried to argue in the paper, and you do forgive me for being a little bit rusty on this paper, which I wrote a few years ago now. We have an early Ibn Masūd reading, variant readings, different readings than as canonized, which is an early phenomenon, well known. We have the development of this in Kufa as a standard text, as a standard approach into the 1st century, into the time of Nakhai. This affects the initial formation of the Hanafi school, and the rule, the evidence basis for Shaybani. It then gets explained by later Hanafis. You have an Iraqi stream through Jassas and Quduri, which takes a strong view on the need for a kind of tawatur source, and therefore starts to argue for the closing of the canon, even in the time of the Prophet ﷺ, that there was no possibility of these things being recited out after the life of the Messenger ﷺ. But in the Samarkandi tradition, Maturidi, to some extent, figures like Ad-Dabusi, there is the understanding that actually weaker sources than just pure tawatur could potentially provide certain ziyada on the Quran, could provide certain types of bayan. And for this reason, and also their wider approach, they were more open to the idea that Ibn Masūd did recite this variant, that it's a well-known reading. And as far as Maturidi seems to be concerned, it's perfectly valid to read. There's no evidence, I'm seeing no evidence from Maturidi that Ibn Masūd variants are not readable. In fact, in another paper, I actually point out that in a different verse, there's a place where Maturidi seems to be preferring Ibn Masūd's reading to the standard Quranic reading, but I don't have time to go into that today, and I don't have it up pulled up to look at. So hopefully that was interesting. I look forward to questions. Jazakallah khairan, walhamdulillah rabbil alamin.